Hello everybody, welcome back. If you're new to the group, each week Molly and I present a word, and that word is designed to be a guide for journaling, meditation, contemplation, and discussion. And this week's word is example. Now I'm going to talk about example in comparison to a word from a prior week, influence, because I think that there's a very distinct difference between influence and example. And with example, I'm talking about the example that you set, the example that you set in your life, the example that you set as someone who impacts your environment. So whether you're a boss, a coworker, a sibling, a parent, a child, a spouse, in a relationship, a friend, no matter what the relationship is, when you are not by yourself, you're setting an example. So some personalities have a stronger sense of setting an example, and it's harder for them to relax or kind of act freely without considering the example that they're setting. Some people, some personalities don't really pay much attention to the example that they're setting, but are definitely setting an example, but they're not mindful of that. They're reacting and acting in their own manner. They go with their instinct and their gut and their natural responses to things. So some personalities are more controlled, have more self-control naturally, and have to learn to relax. Some personalities are more impulsive and have to learn to pull back on that impulsiveness and have some self-control. So when it comes to personalities, when it comes to the IMR system and the 9 personalities, this is another one of those words where it's kind of a black and white. So you're either paying a lot of attention to the example that you're setting, you're very mindful of your position as someone who could have influence, and other personalities are not. Now, when we look at influence, the difference, example is something that you're doing without even thinking about it. So your actions on a daily basis set an example, and the people around you, especially children or younger people or people that you have influence over, are going to look at that example and react and behave kind of accordingly. So when you have a child or someone who's more influential, they're going to be susceptible to your example. So when you think about like do as I say, not as I do, the example that you're setting, you're going to hear children or other people around you who kind of parrot or mimic your behaviors, and you might not think much of what you do or say until you hear it come out of the mouth of somebody else, and you're like, oh, I didn't really like how that sounded. And if you pay attention to yourself, you'll realize that came from you. Maybe that's something that you say or you do in the heat of the moment, or you do in a reactive state, and that example is having an influence on the people around you. So I think influence is also one of those words where different personalities have different influence. So some personalities are big personalities, so they have a lot of influence over their environment. Some personalities are more subtle, and they don't necessarily want to or have a lot of influence over their environment. But they're still, no matter what your personality is, whether you're a big personality with a lot of influence or a more subtle personality with less influence, you're still setting an example. And that's, I think, the important key difference in these words, and the importance of example is that that's happening whether you realize it or not. That's happening whether you want it to or not. So how are you behaving on a daily basis? What kind of example are you setting out there in the world? Are you focusing on the positive? Are you maintaining some self-control? Are you living in that place of balance? Are you working every day on maintaining that balance in your life, staying out of like the fringes of behavior and reactiveness? Or are you just all over the place? Are you doing whatever you want, saying whatever you want, and not really caring about what's going on around you? Because your example that you're setting is going to show up. That a lot of that energy that you put out there is going to be mirrored back to you by the people in your environment. So if you're putting out a lot of volatile, negative energy, or even energy where you're blaming things on other people, or you're looking really at the negative side of things, or you're living in that very intense space of reactiveness, you're going to get a lot of that back. You're going to get a lot of that in return in the world. And that really is because of your ability to set an example, whether you like it or not, whether you're intending to set an example or not. So I thought the word example was interesting. It took a little time for Molly and I in discussion after we had both contemplated the word to really figure out what the difference is there between example and influence, because they sound and feel like very similar words. But I think one is definitely happening all the time, whether you like it or not, and the other really has a lot to do with how big your energy is. So you're always setting an example, and how much influence you have depends on whether people trust you, whether people are impacted by your energy, and these kind of other outliers that depend more on your environment and more on the people that you're talking about. So what kind of example are you setting, and how does that example influence your environment? And that's the contemplation that I'm having this week, that I would love to hear your thoughts on this week. And I really enjoyed this one. So I hope you really liked my talk, and I hope you have a wonderful time also contemplating this word. And thank you for showing up today.